The moment the cameras started rolling, the air inside the ballroom shifted. You could feel it, that strange tension that fills a room when everyone is pretending to be polite but secretly waiting for something to go wrong. The chandeliers above the audience cast a soft golden glow, but the energy below was anything but warm. Meghan Markle was about to walk onto the stage at Fortune's most powerful women's summit in Washington, D.C., an event that had hosted world leaders, CEOs, and pioneers who had shattered ceilings through grit and vision. Yet on this night, something was off. Something was brewing, and no one knew it was about to explode in front of millions. The applause started before she even appeared, not out of excitement, but out of obligation. A low, hesitant clapping that felt more like a warning shot than a welcome. Cameras zoomed in. Some faces smiled, but their eyes didn't. They were watching carefully, studying every move, waiting to see if this would be the moment Meghan redeemed her image or destroyed it completely. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because let's be honest, by the time Meghan Markle stepped onto that stage, her reputation was already hanging by a thread. The Netflix deals, the Spotify collapse, the constant controversies about her truth versus everyone else's truth. It all followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. But Washington, D.C. isn't Hollywood. It's not a place that claps for charisma, it claps for credibility. And that was the one thing Meghan was struggling to hold on to. Imagine this. The room filled with some of the most influential women in business, politics, and activism. Women who had built empires, broken barriers, and fought to earn every seat at the table. Then, in walks Meghan Markle, royal title, Hollywood pedigree, designer gown, and a media storm trailing behind her. The optics were powerful, but the question hanging in the air was louder than any introduction could drown out. Why was she here? That's what makes this story so electrifying, because what unfolded next wasn't just about a speech. It wasn't about empowerment or gender or leadership. It was about something deeper, authenticity. The crowd didn't just react to Meghan's words. They reacted to the disconnect between her message and her reality. And that's what made this moment so explosive. Now, before we dive into the chaos that erupted that night, the boos, the heckles, the whispers that turned into headlines, let's rewind. Let's go back to the days leading up to the event, because the warning signs were already there. Fortune's most powerful women's summit wasn't just another glossy networking event. It was an institution, a gathering of those who'd earned their stripes. The kind of place where every word mattered, every appearance carried weight. Meghan's invitation had been met with murmurs from the moment it was announced. Some questioned whether she fit the criteria. After all, her brand had been built more on celebrity influence than corporate impact. Others defended her, saying she'd become a voice for modern women navigating power, fame, and identity. But behind the scenes, organizers were nervous. Sponsors were reportedly uneasy about backlash. Even staff whispered about potential protests or disruptions. And they weren't wrong to worry. You see, Meghan's reputation in American circles had shifted dramatically in recent months. She was no longer the fresh-faced duchess stepping into royal life. She was now a polarizing figure, admired by some, resented by others. Every move she made was dissected online, every word analyzed for hypocrisy or hidden agenda. So when she decided to take the stage in front of Washington's power elite, the stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just another speech. It was a test. A test of how much the world was still willing to listen. The lights dimmed. The host gave a brief, carefully worded introduction. There was no over-the-top praise, no fawning about royalty or Hollywood glamour. Just a neutral tone, almost clinical. Please welcome Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. A title that hung awkwardly in the air. Half the room applauded politely, the other half barely moved. You could almost hear the sound of judgment in the silence. Then she appeared, smiling, poised, confident on the outside. Her outfit was immaculate, her movements graceful. But as she adjusted the microphone and scanned the crowd, that polished smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Maybe she felt it. That undercurrent of skepticism. That wall of unspoken doubt. And for a woman who'd built her brand on controlling the narrative, that must have been terrifying. Her opening line was meant to be inspiring. When women support women, incredible things happen. But instead of the usual nods and claps, there was an odd pause. A few polite chuckles. A cough from the back row. It wasn't the reaction she expected, and definitely not the one she rehearsed for. Because the truth is, many in that audience didn't believe her anymore. Not after the years of headlines, interviews, and public feuds that painted her as both victim and villain, often in the same breath. Still, Meghan pushed forward. She spoke about leadership, about resilience, about using one's platform for good. But each line sounded familiar, recycled, like something she'd said before on a podcast or an Instagram Live. The problem wasn't what she was saying, it was who was saying it, and how it clashed with what people had already seen. The authenticity gap was too wide to ignore. And the audience, sharp, perceptive, and unforgiving, could sense it instantly. That's when the murmurs began. Soft at first, like a ripple across still water. A few people leaning toward their neighbors. Others glancing at their phones, perhaps scrolling through Twitter, where live updates were already buzzing. "She's being booed," one tweet read. "No, it's background noise," another argued. But then came the sound that confirmed everyone's worst suspicion. A sharp, distinct boo from somewhere near the center of the room. It was quick, barely a second long, but it changed the entire atmosphere. You could see Meghan's posture tighten, her smile freeze for half a breath. The moderators exchanged nervous looks. The camera panned awkwardly away. For a moment, time stood still. Then came another, louder this time. And then another. The boos didn't come in waves. They came like cracks in glass, spreading unpredictably. A few people clapped louder to drown them out. Others stared in disbelief. But Meghan? She did what she always does. She smiled through it. That practiced, polished, perfect smile. But her eyes told a different story. There was something there. Fear, confusion, maybe disbelief. Because for the first time, she wasn't controlling the message. The crowd was. And in that split second, everything changed. But let's pause here for a moment. Because what makes this scene so fascinating isn't just the sound of boos echoing through a ballroom. It's what led to that reaction, and what it revealed about Meghan's relationship with the public. Was this just another example of internet outrage spilling into real life? Or was it something deeper? A collective statement from women who felt betrayed by someone who once claimed to represent them? That's the irony that makes this story so gripping. Meghan was there to talk about empowerment. Yet she was being rejected by the very demographic she claimed to empower. She spoke about unity, but the room was divided. She preached authenticity, but few believed her words. It's the contradiction that defines her public image, and it played out in real time before a live audience. And as those boos echoed, the cameras caught something else. A few faces in the front row smirking. A whispered comment that made another attendee cover her mouth to hide a laugh. This wasn't just discomfort anymore, it was mockery. Something personal had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer professional or polite, it was charged with disdain. Still, Meghan powered through. That's one thing you can't deny, her resilience. She kept her tone even, her words steady. But the applause that followed each segment was shorter, weaker, forced. It was the kind of applause people give when they're waiting for something to end, not when they're inspired. And she must have felt that too. Now, imagine being in that position. Thousands watching live. Cameras capturing every blink. Critics ready to pounce on every expression. What do? You can't walk off. You can't confront them. You just stand there, trapped between dignity and disbelief, praying that somehow the moment will pass. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder. The tension became suffocating. And then, in a moment that would go viral within minutes, one voice cut through the noise. A heckler. Clear, loud, unmistakable. The words weren't kind. They were personal. And they hit like a thunderclap across the room. The moderators froze. Meghan tried to continue. The cameras cut to wide shots, trying to mask the chaos. But the damage was done. The clip would soon flood social media, dissected frame by frame, sound by sound. And what it revealed about that night, and about Meghan's unraveling public image, would spark debates that still rage today. Because here's the truth. That night in Washington wasn't just about one woman being booed. It was about the collision between image and reality. Between what Meghan says she stands for, and what people believe she really represents. And that collision didn't just expose cracks in her brand. It exposed the cultural divide she's come to symbolize. So buckle up. Because if you think the boos were shocking, wait until you hear what happened next, when the heckling turned personal, and Meghan's carefully crafted image began to crumble in real time. The rain had stopped just minutes before her motorcade arrived, but the air in Washington still felt heavy, thick with humidity and expectation. Outside the Grand Hotel hosting Fortune's most powerful women's summit, journalists stood shoulder to shoulder behind metal barricades. Cameramen adjusted their lenses, producers whispered into earpieces, and assistants darted back and forth, clutching clipboards and coffee cups. The scene looked like a red carpet event, not a leadership summit, and that was the first clue that Meghan Markle's arrival was going to be different. Then, right on cue, the sleek black SUV rolled up to the curb. The door opened. Out stepped Meghan, radiant, confident, and every inch the image of control. Her outfit was flawless, a cream-colored power suit, understated jewelry, glossy hair that caught the evening light. She paused for the cameras, offering that trademark smile, warm enough to seem human, but polished enough to feel rehearsed. But what the cameras didn't capture right away was how divided the crowd's reaction really was. There were cheers, yes, but faint, scattered. A few supporters who had waited outside all day hoping to glimpse the Duchess. But underneath that, there was something else. Whispers, low murmurs, even a few sarcastic laughs. It wasn't hostility, not yet. It was judgment, the silent kind that lingers when people have already made up their minds about you before you even open your mouth. And Meghan felt it. You could see it in the brief flicker of her eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw before she turned her head toward the entrance. She had been here before. The performance, the scrutiny, the balancing act between admiration and disdain. But this time was different. This wasn't a Hollywood crowd or a sympathetic podcast audience. This was D.C., a city built on merit, legacy, and influence. The kind of place where reputations are earned, not curated. As she walked toward the entrance, her security detail flanked her in perfect formation. Flashes from cameras illuminated her path like lightning. A reporter shouted a question. "Meghan, do you think women in power are born or made?" But she didn't answer. She simply smiled and kept walking, the question hanging in the air like static. Because that was the problem. For many in that room, Meghan's version of power wasn't the kind you earned. It was the kind you married into. Inside, the atmosphere was polished, elegant, but tense. The summit's organizers had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Behind the curtain, a producer whispered into her headset, "She's here." Assistants adjusted the stage lighting, ensuring it hit the podium just right. The event director glanced nervously at her notes. Meghan's scheduled slot was already controversial. Even before she arrived, there had been debate over her inclusion. One executive reportedly questioned whether her presence would overshadow the other speakers. Another argued that Meghan represented a new kind of influence, softer, media-driven, global, the kind that sells out auditoriums and draws clicks, even if it divides opinion. That was the quiet war being fought behind the scenes, between prestige and publicity. And tonight, it was all coming to a head. Backstage, Meghan's team hovered like satellites. Her personal assistant checked her notes one last time, adjusting the printout of her talking points. A communications advisor whispered about optics, how long she should pause, when to make eye contact, what kind of tone to use when discussing women's empowerment. Every word had been rehearsed, every gesture calculated. This was more than a speech. It was an image restoration project, wrapped in applause lines. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone backstage was convinced she belonged there. A veteran journalist, covering the event for a respected outlet, reportedly muttered, "Powerful women?" or "Powerful PR?" under her breath as Meghan passed by. Another attendee, a CEO who'd spent decades climbing corporate ranks, told a colleague, "She's not one of us. She's performing." The irony? They were saying this at an event about breaking barriers for women. Yet the barriers around Meghan were emotional, not professional. She wasn't being rejected because she was a woman in power. She was being rejected because of what that power represented. And yet, in that moment, Meghan looked untouchable. She exuded calm confidence, smiling politely at event staff, thanking them for their work. On the surface, she was grace personified. But under that exterior, there was something more, urgency. Because she knew this was her chance to rewrite the narrative. To remind the world that she was more than the headlines, more than the podcasts, more than the fractured royal story that followed her everywhere. When she entered the ballroom, Conversations dimmed into murmurs. Heads turned. The energy shifted again, that strange mix of fascination and friction. Some women stood to clap, others remained seated, arms crossed. The applause was neither thunderous nor warm. It was polite, controlled, and Meghan noticed. You can always tell when a crowd isn't with you, when claps feel like formality instead of celebration. She walked past rows of executives, senators, philanthropists, and media personalities, all watching closely. Not one detail escaped their gaze. Not her smile, not her posture, not even the tone of her voice as she greeted the moderator. This wasn't admiration. This was assessment. And yet, somewhere in that quiet judgment, a whisper began spreading among attendees. A small one at first, but it grew. She wasn't supposed to go first. She wasn't even confirmed until last night. Her name wasn't printed in the official brochure. That last rumor spread fast, and whether true or not, it lit the fuse. People began exchanging knowing looks. Some rolled their eyes. Others checked their programs, flipping pages as if to confirm the suspicion. The air grew heavier. The irony of it all. Meghan had insisted on discretion before the event. Her team reportedly wanted her appearance to feel unannounced, organic, authentic. But the strategy backfired. Instead of intrigue, it fueled the narrative that she had forced her way into a spotlight meant for others. And as the whispers grew louder, Meghan's team sensed it too. Backstage, a staff member whispered into her earpiece, "Crowd feels cold. Keep it warm, keep it personal." Meghan nodded subtly, adjusting her expression, readying herself for the stage. But even before she spoke a single word, something in the room had already turned against her. Now, here's where things take an unexpected twist. Just minutes before Meghan's speech, another speaker, a respected female founder, had privately complained to organizers. She felt Meghan's slot had been rushed ahead of hers. "I've worked 20 years for this moment," she reportedly said. She walks in and gets the prime spot. The resentment wasn't just personal. It reflected something larger, a sentiment many powerful women quietly shared. That Meghan's brand of empowerment came without the bruises and scars that real power demands. Still, none of this tension was visible on camera. The live stream showed nothing but glamour, a packed ballroom, applause, laughter. But those who were there knew the truth, that the applause was hollow, the smiles were strained, and the energy was fragile. One wrong word, one wrong tone, could tip it all over. And it almost did, before she even took the mic. During her pre-stage walkthrough, a minor incident occurred. One attendee, trying to take a selfie near the stage, accidentally brushed past Meghan's assistant. Security stepped in, voices raised for a moment, and suddenly all eyes turned. The attendee's embarrassed apology did little to calm the murmurs. "She travels with more security than the vice president," someone whispered. The remark drew quiet chuckles, but Meghan didn't react. She simply waited, still poised, still smiling. But that smile, that carefully crafted shield, was beginning to strain. Because despite her best efforts, she could sense the resistance. This wasn't London tabloids or Hollywood critics. This was a room full of powerful women, the very audience she had hoped would embrace her. And yet, they weren't. It's strange, isn't it? How silence can be louder than sound. As Meghan sat waiting for her cue, the ballroom felt colder. Conversations quieted. Phones were lifted discreetly, recording her reactions. And in that stillness, her eyes darted briefly to the front row, where one woman in a navy dress sat stone-faced, arms folded, not clapping, not smiling, just watching. That image would go viral later. The woman who didn't clap for Meghan Markle. But in that moment, it was just another crack in the illusion. When the stage manager finally gestured for her to step up, Meghan stood, took a deep breath, and began her walk to the podium. The music swelled softly, the lights brightened, the audience clapped again, still polite, still detached. Every footstep echoed louder than the applause. And somewhere, at the edge of the stage, a journalist whispered to her colleague, "She's walking into a storm." The storm wasn't outside. It was inside the room, simmering, unseen, but ready to erupt. Because just as Meghan reached the microphone, adjusted her notes, and smiled for the cameras, a soft murmur rippled through the audience once more. A faint voice from the middle rows muttered something, indistinct, almost like a warning. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. No one could quite tell what was said, but it was enough to unsettle the calm. Meghan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before speaking. She cleared her throat, steadied her voice, and began her opening line. But what she didn't realize then, what no one could have predicted, was that this wasn't just the beginning of her speech. It was the beginning of a public unraveling. Because from that very first moment on stage, the room wasn't listening. It was judging. And by the time she reached her second paragraph, judgment would turn into something much darker and much louder. Because someone in that crowd was about to stand up and make their disapproval impossible to ignore. And that's when everything changed. The ballroom lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as Meghan began to speak, her voice steady and controlled. But behind that calm delivery was tension you could almost feel through the air. The audience of executives, politicians, and thought leaders, women who had built their careers brick by brick, sat in perfectly straight lines, the clinking of glasses and soft rustle of papers filling the otherwise silent room. No one dared interrupt, yet no one leaned forward either. It was a strange stillness, the kind that hides judgment behind polite stillness. At first glance, the crowd appeared attentive, but if you looked closely, you could see it. Crossed arms, fixed smiles, the subtle head tilts of people who were listening, but not believing. The cameras panned across the audience, and for a split second, their faces told the story the headlines wouldn't. Skepticism, fatigue, even irritation. And Meghan felt it. Every speaker can sense when a room is slipping away. Her words were polished, almost too polished. Phrases about women lifting each other up, about navigating spaces not designed for you, about standing in your truth. Beautiful phrases, yes, but familiar ones. Ones she'd said before. Ones the audience had heard 100 times from others. This wasn't new. It wasn't raw. And in Washington, that kind of repetition doesn't inspire, it irritates. Halfway through her introduction, the sound system crackled. Just a faint hum, barely noticeable. But Meghan paused, glanced briefly toward the technicians at the back, and smiled awkwardly. Technology always chooses the best moments, doesn't it? She quipped, earning a polite ripple of laughter. Polite, but cold. It was the kind of laughter people give because they know they're supposed to. It didn't come from warmth. It came from discomfort. That's when the energy shifted completely. A woman in the second row, a respected journalist who had covered every Fortune Summit since its founding, leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "She's losing them." The colleague nodded. The applause that had followed her introduction was already forgotten. What lingered now was a sense of impatience. You could practically hear the unspoken thought echoing around the room. Get to the point. But Meghan couldn't feel that yet. She pressed forward, pacing her words carefully, adjusting her posture just as she'd practiced. Her team had spent weeks preparing her for this. The pauses, the inflections, the emotional turns. Every moment was choreographed to make her appear natural. Yet ironically, that's what made it feel so unnatural. Authenticity can't be rehearsed, and that's where the audience felt the gap. She told a story about resilience, about how she'd once felt silenced, misunderstood, and underestimated. Her voice softened, the room quieted slightly, but still, there was resistance. A few people exchanged knowing looks, the kind that said, "Here we go again." Because in that crowd sat women who had clawed their way to the top through grit and long nights, through rejection and failure, without Netflix specials, palace titles, or multi-million-dollar PR teams. To them, Meghan's version of struggle sounded curated, safe, sanitized. It's not that the audience hated her. It's that they didn't believe her. One attendee later told a reporter, "It wasn't that she said the wrong thing. It's that she said nothing new. We came to be inspired, not managed." That was the quiet truth. Inspiration requires vulnerability, and Meghan's speech felt like armor. Every sentence was guarded, every emotion measured. She was trying to connect, but from a distance. And that's when the first real moment of tension happened. As Meghan paused to sip water, a faint voice from the back muttered something, too low to catch fully, but sharp enough to cut the quiet. A few heads turned. Someone coughed to cover the sound. Meghan froze for half a second before continuing. It wasn't loud enough to derail her, but it rattled her. You could see it in the subtle shift of her expression, the flicker of uncertainty behind her eyes. Now, picture the scene. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her, cameras flashing intermittently, the stage lights hot and unrelenting. Her polished delivery began to crack, just slightly. She stumbled over a word, corrected herself, laughed it off. But the crowd didn't laugh with her this time. They just watched. The silence grew heavier. Then, the moderator, sensing the discomfort, tried to interject, asking a follow-up question meant to steer things back on track. Meghan, when you talk about redefining power, what does that look like to you in practice? It was a good question. Simple, thoughtful. But Meghan hesitated. You could almost hear the gears turning. She launched into a long, flowing answer about compassion, leadership, and representation, but it lacked something. Specifics. Realness. It sounded like something from a campaign brochure, not from a lived experience. And that's when the murmurs began again. Soft at first, then clearer. She's dodging. This is rehearsed. She's not answering the question. Not everyone in the audience joined in. Most remained silent, their faces unreadable. But the vibe in the room had changed. The respect had cooled into indifference. The anticipation had turned into quiet critique. Even the applause that followed her next point sounded like obligation. Brief, mechanical, and quickly fading. And yet, through it all, Meghan smiled. That signature smile. It's the same one she used during interviews when questions turned hostile, graceful, composed, yet somehow distant. But in that ballroom, that smile had the opposite effect. It made her seem detached, above the moment, not within it. What made this scene so surreal was how visible the tension was even through the cameras. The live stream caught glimpses of it, the uneasy audience, the stiff reactions, the pauses that dragged just a little too long. Viewers online noticed. Within minutes, Twitter and TikTok lit up with clips labeled "awkward silence" and "crowd turns cold." But back inside the room, something else was happening, something the cameras didn't catch. At a table near the front sat a cluster of young entrepreneurs, invited for their startup success stories. They had been enthusiastic at first, taking photos, nodding politely. But as Meghan spoke about creating safe spaces for women to rise, one of them leaned to another and whispered, "It's hard to relate when your safe space is a mansion in Montecito." They chuckled softly, covering their mouths, but others nearby heard it and smirked. Word spread fast. You could feel the ripple of shared amusement. The tension wasn't just about disagreement anymore. It was becoming personal. Then came the moment that would later become infamous among attendees. As Meghan began describing how she's had to find her own voice in rooms that tried to silence her, a woman in the audience, sitting in the third row, close enough to be seen, lowered her head, shook it slightly, and muttered, "Oh, please." The microphone didn't catch it, but the cameras did. The tiny gesture, the eye roll, the whisper. Within hours, it would be frozen into a viral still frame. Still, Meghan pressed on. Her tone softened again, leaning into vulnerability. She talked about motherhood, about balancing identity and ambition, about how women are often criticized more harshly for asserting themselves. It was a good message. But the delivery, the timing, the tone, felt off. Because by this point, the crowd wasn't listening for inspiration. They were waiting for her to misstep. And then, it happened. As she reached the middle of her talk, Meghan referenced being misunderstood by institutions that prefer silence to change. It was vague enough to sound profound, but everyone knew what she was implying. The royal family, the media, the system. And that's when the collective patience of the room snapped. A low murmur spread again, louder this time, unmistakable. You could hear it in the back rows, rising like static. A few attendees shook their heads, one audibly sighed. Someone whispered, "Not this again." And for the first time, Meghan's composure cracked. Her eyes darted to the front row, then to the moderator, as if searching for reassurance. But the moderator's frozen smile said it all. Keep going. So she did. Her next line came out too quickly, her voice slightly strained. And when women raise their voices, they're often told they're too much, too ambitious, too loud. That's when it happened. A faint, sharp noise. It wasn't applause. It wasn't laughter. It was, unmistakably, a boo. It was brief, but real. Someone had actually done it. And though it stopped as quickly as it started, the shockwave it sent through the room was palpable. A few gasps. A nervous chuckle from somewhere near the back. The moderator's hand tightened on her cue cards. The production crew backstage froze. Meghan blinked, paused, smiled again. "It's okay," she said softly, forcing a light laugh. That's what happens when women use their voices, right? Polite claps followed. Thin, hesitant, guilty claps. But the damage was done. The atmosphere had fractured. It was no longer a polite audience. It was a room divided. And even as she continued, her tone wavered. She wrapped up the section faster than planned, skipping part of her notes. Her words blurred together. The warmth she'd hoped to project had vanished, replaced by defensiveness. Then, out of nowhere, another sound. Not a boo this time, but a heckle. A sharp voice from the middle rows, cutting through the polite claps like a blade. Practice what you preach. Gasps filled the air. Meghan froze mid-sentence. The moderator's face went pale. Security began moving subtly toward the center aisle. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Meghan did something unexpected. She smiled wider, almost defiantly. "That's exactly what I'm here to do," she replied, her tone calm but firm. It was a smart move. The crowd gave another short burst of applause. But this time, it wasn't out of admiration. It was out of discomfort, out of pity, out of confusion. And as she wrapped up her segment, her closing words almost trembled. When women support each other, the impossible becomes possible. She stepped back from the microphone, gave a small wave, and walked off the stage. The applause was quick, too quick, like everyone was just relieved it was over. But what Meghan didn't know yet was that the worst part hadn't even started. Because backstage, journalists were already typing. Clips were already uploading. Tweets were already circulating. And within minutes, the headlines would hit, each one more brutal than the last. But before those headlines reached the world, something else happened in that ballroom. A confrontation that cameras missed. A moment that would turn a tense evening into a full-blown scandal. And it started the second Meghan stepped off stage. Because one woman was waiting for her, and she wasn't about to stay silent. The applause that followed Meghan off the stage wasn't applause, it was escape. The kind that bursts out when tension finally snaps, when people clap just to end the silence. Backstage, her team surrounded her like a protective shield, whispering reassurances. "You were great. Ignore the noise. They loved your message." But Meghan could feel it. The air was wrong. The warmth she expected, the smiles, the nods, the validation, weren't there. Instead, she was met with the kind of politeness that hurts more than open criticism. Minutes earlier, on that stage, her opening words had been carefully chosen to inspire. When women support women, incredible things happen. Simple, powerful, relatable. The kind of line that had earned her applause at other events. But in Washington, it landed differently. The room didn't lean in, it pulled back. Because for that particular crowd, the phrase wasn't motivational, it was ironic. And irony has a way of burning when it's unintentional. Let's rewind a little to the moment Meghan stepped onto that stage. Cameras flashed, the spotlight hit her perfectly, and for a brief second, she looked like she owned the moment. But the thing about moments is that they're fragile. One word, one pause, one misplaced tone can crack them wide open. And for Meghan, that crack came almost immediately. She began with a story, something her team believed would humanize her. She told the audience about being a young woman in the entertainment industry, about struggling to find her voice, about being told to just smile and stay quiet. She spoke with conviction, her tone passionate, rehearsed to sound off the cuff. It should have worked. It usually did. But not this time. Because the women in that ballroom, CEOs, senators, innovators, had all been told the same thing in their lives. The difference? They didn't have a palace platform or a global audience to push back with. They had to fight in silence. And so, as Meghan described her journey from Hollywood actress to duchess to advocate, a quiet skepticism filled the room. Someone in the third row whispered, "Must be nice to struggle with a title." Another murmured, "Does she even hear herself?" Those whispers carried, subtle but sharp, bouncing between tables like tiny echoes of dissent. Meghan didn't hear them, but she felt the cold shift in the room. Still, she pressed on. She moved into her first empowerment statement, the one her team had carefully crafted to trend online. "When we raise our voices, we raise others too." It was supposed to be the soundbite, the line every outlet would quote. But instead of applause, there was stillness. You could almost hear the air conditioning hum. And then came the first nervous chuckle, not from Meghan, but from the audience. The kind of chuckle people use to fill silence when something feels off. She smiled wider, trying to push through. "You know," she added, I've been told that sometimes my voice makes people uncomfortable. And that's okay. It means it's being heard. That was the wrong line for that room. Because to the women in that audience, power wasn't about being heard. It was about earning the right to be heard. Many had built careers on years of experience, hard decisions, and failures overcome. Meghan's voice, to them, wasn't a symbol of courage, it was a brand. A product sold through headlines and sound bites. The reaction was instant. A few heads tilted. A few smiles tightened. The applause that followed was scattered, half-hearted. It wasn't that they hated what she said. They just didn't buy it. Still, Meghan stayed composed. Her voice softened, her expression sincere. She moved to her next anecdote, about motherhood, about raising children in the public eye, about wanting them to grow up in a world where women's stories are celebrated, not silenced. It was emotional, and for a brief moment, the room softened. Some nodded. A few even smiled genuinely. But then she said it, the line that would light the fuse. When I think of my journey, I realize that sometimes the greatest challenge isn't fighting your enemies. It's realizing that your enemies were never outside the palace. They were sitting right beside you. You could hear a pin drop. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't vague. Everyone knew who she meant. The royal family, the institution, the people who, in her words, had silenced her. And in that room full of women who valued professionalism, discretion, and control, it came across as bitterness. There was no applause, no sympathetic nods, just silence. Cold, stiff, uncomfortable silence. And then, a cough, a shifting of chairs, a low whisper from the middle rows. Oh, she went there. That whisper broke the dam. Suddenly, small murmurs filled the air, like wind rustling through dry leaves. A few heads shook. Others turned away. It wasn't outrage, it was disbelief. Because for the first time, the audience wasn't hearing Meghan Markle the advocate. They were hearing Meghan Markle the complainer. The woman who, in their eyes, couldn't move on. Meghan, sensing the tension, tried to pivot. She added, "Of course, we all face moments where people misunderstand us. But when we rise above, we inspire others to do the same." She smiled again, trying to reframe it, but the damage was done. The crowd wasn't following her anymore. They were reacting to her. And then it happened. The moment no one saw coming. From somewhere near the front, a voice, firm, female, and unmistakably irritated, called out, "You mean like how you inspired your own family?" Gasps. Genuine, audible gasps. Meghan froze. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes widened just a fraction. The kind of micro-expression that reveals shock before control takes over. The moderator, sitting beside her, leaned forward, smiling tightly, whispering something that sounded like, "Ignore it." The crowd held its breath. And then Meghan did something fascinating, something that told you everything about her mindset. She laughed. A soft, airy, practiced laugh. The kind she used in interviews when caught off guard. "Well," she said lightly, "every family has their challenges, don't they?" A few nervous chuckles. A few claps. But most faces stayed blank. Because the problem wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. The tone was dismissive, not vulnerable. It sounded like spin, not truth. The moderator quickly jumped in with a question about navigating criticism, but it didn't help. The audience's energy had shifted entirely. Meghan's words, meant to inspire, had backfired spectacularly. From there, her rhythm was gone. Her pacing faltered. The charisma that usually carried her seemed to wane. She started speaking faster, trying to fill the space that applause usually occupied. Her voice lost its warmth. She began to sound defensive, passionate, but sharp. She said, "When people try to silence you, it means they fear your voice." Another applause line. Another silence. Because that line, intended as empowerment, came off as self-pity. And that's when one woman, sitting near the center, shook her head and muttered just loud enough for her table to hear. Or maybe they're just tired of the noise. That line, caught on a nearby microphone, would later surface online, played and replayed across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube Reels. It became the tagline for the night. Tired of the noise. But back in that ballroom, Meghan pushed forward, unaware that her speech was already unraveling online. Her hands tightened on the podium. Her breathing quickened slightly. She began emphasizing words too hard, almost like she was trying to will the crowd into agreement. "Women are not here to be liked," she said. We are here to lead. This time, the applause came, but it wasn't real. It was the kind of applause people give when they sense the speaker needs it. A mercy clap. Short. Hollow. Gone within seconds. And that was when Meghan made her second mistake, one that made even her own team cringe backstage. She looked directly into the audience and said, "You know, sometimes when women criticize other women, it says more about them than about the woman they're criticizing." The statement might have sounded empowering in another context, but not in a room where the audience was other women. Women who had just been side-eyed, accused of internalized sexism, and lumped together as critics instead of professionals. That single line turned the room ice cold. You could see it. Shoulders stiffened. Eyes narrowed. Some even stopped clapping altogether. One executive at a front table reportedly whispered, "She's lecturing us now?" The irony couldn't have been sharper. The speech about empowerment was now alienating the very women it was meant to uplift. The moderator, sensing disaster, cut in again. "That's such a powerful point, Meghan. Let's talk about what advice you'd give to young women watching this." But Meghan wasn't done. She leaned in, voice stronger now, almost defiant. "I tell them this. Don't let anyone's opinion of you define your worth. You define your own story." It should have been a triumphant close. It was meant to be her mic drop line, but it landed flat. The applause that followed was lukewarm, hesitant, fragmented. And then, from the back, faint but distinct, came another boo. This time, it wasn't isolated. It was followed by a hiss. A few gasps. A nervous laugh from the crowd. The moderator looked like she'd seen a ghost. Meghan froze again, blinking fast, that familiar, strained smile plastered across her face. She nodded slowly, her voice tightening as she said, "It's okay. Change is uncomfortable." But everyone in that room knew. This wasn't about change. This was about credibility. When she finally stepped away from the podium, the applause was almost merciful, quick and shallow. The kind of applause that signals the end of something awkward. She walked off stage, chin high, smile firm, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her notes. And the second she disappeared behind the curtain, the whispers erupted. No longer whispers, but full sentences. Did she really go there? She just insulted the room. I can't believe she said that. Even the event organizers looked shaken. One quietly muttered, "We've never had this happen before." And Meghan? She stood backstage, staring into the floor-length mirror, her reflection framed by the bright bulbs of the vanity. Her smile was gone now. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were glassy. She whispered something to her assistant. No one caught the words, and then turned away from the mirror. Because just then, a producer rushed in, phone in hand, face pale. "Meghan," she said quietly, "you need to see this." On the screen was a clip, just 20 seconds long, already going viral on social media. The headline above it read, "Crowd boos Meghan Markle during empowerment speech." And that was only the beginning. Because within the next hour, that clip would explode across every major platform, dissected, mocked, analyzed. And what it revealed about that night would turn a simple speech into a global spectacle. But the real damage wasn't the boos or the heckles. It was what came next, when someone in that very ballroom decided to speak out. And what she said would change everything. It started as a whisper, a single, uncertain sound, barely audible over the polite rustle of papers and the hum of air conditioning. But in a room packed with Washington's elite, where silence is the default and decorum the rule, even a whisper can become a thunderclap. At first, no one believed it had happened. People looked around, eyes darting, faces tightening, waiting for confirmation that they'd really heard what they thought they heard. A boo. At the Fortune's most powerful women's summit, directed at Meghan Markle. Unthinkable. But it happened. And once it did, there was no taking it back. The moment hung in the air like smoke after a spark. The moderator froze mid-smile. Meghan blinked. The sound replayed in everyone's minds, like a skipped record no one could unhear. You could see it in the crowd. The unease, the disbelief, and for a few, a strange kind of relief. Someone had said what others were too polite to say. At first, Meghan handled it the only way she knew how, with performance. She smiled, that immaculate, photo-ready smile that could disarm a firing squad. "That's okay," she said lightly, her voice smooth, her tone measured. "Change is uncomfortable." But her eyes betrayed her. There was a flicker, quick, sharp, of something real. Hurt. Shock. Maybe anger. It was gone in an instant, replaced by polished poise. But for those watching closely, it was enough to show the armor had cracked. And then, like a storm gathering strength, the murmurs began to grow. It wasn't chaos, not yet. It was tension in motion. People shifting in their seats, whispering behind programs, pretending to adjust their glasses while stealing glances toward the source of the sound. Where had it come from? Near the center, a woman in a dark blue blazer, a recognizable face to many, sat perfectly still. Her expression was unreadable. Her hands rested neatly on her lap. Some said it came from her section. Others insisted it was someone farther back. No one could agree. But the narrative didn't need truth to take hold. It only needed suspicion. Within seconds, phones came out. Fingers tapped screens. Tweets flew like sparks. Did someone just BO Meghan Markle at the Fortune Summit? I'm in the room. And yes, it happened. Uncomfortable doesn't begin to cover it. The feed exploded. And while the world outside began dissecting a 12-second moment, inside that ballroom, something even more fascinating was happening. Meghan tried to continue. Her voice softened. Her tone shifted to vulnerability. I know that sometimes, when we speak our truth, it challenges others, she said. But that's part of growth. It was a good line. Well delivered. But it fell flat. The words sounded rehearsed. The sincerity forced. Even those who wanted to defend her couldn't. It wasn't about the message anymore. It was about the mood. And the mood had turned. One audience member later told a journalist, "You could feel the temperature drop. People weren't angry. They were done." The applause that followed was awkward. Offbeat. A few claps here and there, like an echo in an empty hall. Meghan nodded, thanked them, and stepped back from the podium. Her heels clicked against the stage floor as she turned, each sound magnified by the uncomfortable quiet that followed. Then came the second wave, not boos this time, but whispers. Rumors, speculation, quiet gossip that traveled faster than light through the high-profile audience. She's out of touch. She made it about herself again. She's blaming the royals, here? Even the event organizers, sitting at the back near the production booth, looked uneasy. One producer leaned to another and whispered, "Do we cut the live stream?" The other shook her head. Too late. Too late, indeed. Because while Meghan was trying to recover backstage, the footage was already spreading online, and in real time, the audience inside the ballroom was watching their own reactions replayed on their phones. Now, here's where it gets surreal. About 10 minutes after Meghan's segment ended, a clip surfaced online, a shaky recording from someone seated mid-row. You could see Meghan at the podium, radiant under the spotlight. Then, as she said, "When women support women, incredible things happen." The audio captured it. That faint, unmistakable boo. Then silence. Then a single, clear voice muttering, "Practice what you preach." The video hit Twitter first. Within minutes, it had over 500,000 views. By the end of the hour, major blogs had reposted it with headlines that ranged from mocking to brutal. Washington turns cold. Meghan booed at Women's Summit. Empowerment speech met with embarrassing reaction. Not the reception she expected. And inside that ballroom, people were reading those headlines while still sitting there. The irony was almost cinematic. But let's go back to Meghan, standing just behind the curtain, watching all of this unfold. Her team was in damage control mode. Phones buzzed. Whispered strategy calls filled the air. One aide muttered, "We can spin this. Say the sound came from outside. Maybe interference." Another whispered, "It was one person. Emphasize that." But Meghan wasn't listening. She stood there, motionless, her hands clasped in front of her. The faint chatter of the next panel drifted through the curtains, polite applause, laughter, the smooth rhythm of speakers who hadn't just been booed on stage. And that contrast, between her awkward silence and their effortless grace, was devastating. She turned to her communications advisor and asked quietly, "Was it that bad?" The advisor hesitated. It wasn't ideal. That was all she needed to hear. But what she didn't know, not yet, was that the fallout wasn't just happening online. It was happening inside that room. Because while Meghan's team scrambled backstage, the audience's conversation had shifted from whispers to open commentary. Groups of women gathered near tables, drinks in hand, dissecting what they'd just witnessed. One journalist, still wearing her press badge, shook her head. "She doesn't read the room." That was self-promotion disguised as empowerment. A CEO added, It's not even that she's wrong. It's just tone deaf. You can't talk about being silenced when you've had Oprah, Netflix, and Spotify at your disposal. Others disagreed. A younger attendee defended her quietly, saying, "At least she's showing up." Most people wouldn't. But even that defense was drowned out by the louder critiques. The consensus forming among the crowd was simple: Meghan had misjudged the audience. And Washington doesn't forgive miscalculations easily. The organizers, sensing the tension, decided to skip the post-panel networking session. They claimed it was a schedule adjustment, but everyone knew the truth. They needed to cool the room down. Meanwhile, Meghan was pacing backstage, her phone lighting up with notifications. Twitter mentions, text from Montecito, a missed call from a familiar number, Harry's. She didn't answer. Not yet. Her assistant finally whispered, "Do you want to leave through the side exit?" But Meghan shook her head. "No, I'll walk out the front." It was pride, maybe, or defiance. But either way, she made her choice. And that choice would lead to the next viral moment. Because when she stepped back into the ballroom later, the reaction was even colder. Gone were the polite claps and fixed smiles. People avoided eye contact. A few nodded out of courtesy. Others simply turned away. The once inviting energy of the event had become something else, something heavy, awkward, final. She smiled anyway, walked with poise. But every step sounded louder now. As she reached the exit, a cluster of journalists called her name. "Meghan, over here." She turned, smiled faintly, ready for questions about her speech. But instead, one reporter asked bluntly, "How does it feel to be booed at a women's empowerment event?" It was a brutal question, and a calculated one. Meghan froze. Her team tried to intervene, ushering her toward the door. But she stopped, turned slightly, and answered with calm precision. "When you stand for something, not everyone will stand with you." It was a good line. It should have landed. But in that moment, surrounded by cameras, it felt hollow, like a pre-written response waiting for an audience that wasn't listening anymore. And then she was gone, swept into her SUV, the door closing with a thud that echoed louder than the applause she'd received hours earlier. Outside, the press lights flickered, photographers shouted, engines roared. But the most powerful noise of the night had already happened, inside that ballroom, in that single, forbidden sound. That boo. Because it wasn't just a sound of disapproval. It was symbolic. A collective exhale from a crowd that had grown tired of performance. By the time Meghan's car disappeared into the DC night, the headlines had reached every corner of the internet. The hashtags trended worldwide. The late-night shows picked it up. Memes flooded social media. Even major networks replayed the clip, analyzing her reaction like it was a political scandal. But the truth is, that moment, that boo, was more than a public embarrassment. It was a mirror. It showed something deeper. The growing divide between Meghan's message and her audience, between perception and reality, between what she wanted to represent and what people believed she really was. And as she sat silently in the back of her SUV, staring out at the Capitol lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets, she must have known. This wasn't just another bad headline. It was a turning point. Because once the crowd turns, once the applause turns to boos, there's no easy way back. But what Meghan didn't know, what no one in that car knew, was that the fallout from that single sound was just beginning. Because somewhere inside that ballroom, a woman who had been sitting near the source of the boo had just received a call from a journalist friend, and she was about to leak something that would make that 12-second clip look like a warm-up act. And when that leak hit the news cycle, Meghan's night would go from bad to historic. The noise had barely settled when it happened. The boo had faded into an uneasy silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. Meghan had stepped away from the podium, her smile a little too still, her eyes darting toward the wings of the stage where her team stood frozen. The moderator, trying to maintain composure, was already thanking sponsors and teasing the next session, her voice trembling just enough to betray the chaos beneath the calm. Then it came, a sound that sliced through the room like glass breaking. "You don't belong here." 3 seconds of complete stillness followed. Everyone turned, hundreds of faces swiveling in one collective movement toward the sound. The words hadn't been shouted in anger. They were sharp, but deliberate, like they'd been waiting to be said. And the woman who said them wasn't some random protester or outsider. She was sitting in the front half of the room, badge around her neck, nameplate on her table. A registered attendee. A guest of the summit. No one could believe it. The camera operators froze. Event staff at the back stared at one another, unsure whether to intervene or let security handle it. The moderator's face went pale. And Meghan? She stood perfectly still, her body angled toward the voice, her eyes narrowing slightly, her hand tightening around her cue cards. There was something almost cinematic about it. That moment where the polished world of stage lights and PR scripts collided with raw, unfiltered emotion. The woman who spoke, later identified by journalists as a former Fortune panelist, a veteran advocate in women's business leadership, didn't shout again. She didn't need to. Her words hung in the air, heavy, impossible to ignore. Meghan tilted her head slightly, trying to maintain her calm. She smiled that diplomatic smile, the one she'd worn during every tough interview, and said softly, "I believe every woman belongs wherever she chooses to stand." A line straight out of her talking points. Perfect on paper, disastrous in the room. The woman in the audience didn't reply. She just stared back, lips pressed in a thin line. A few people near her shifted uncomfortably. One whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Another tried to start applause to defuse the tension, but only a few joined in. It was scattered, hollow, like clapping after a funeral eulogy. And that was when the heckling truly began. From the left side of the ballroom, another voice called out, softer, but equally cutting, "Practice what you preach." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Cameras turned. Someone in the back laughed nervously, unable to handle the tension. The moderator tried to interject again, but the moment had already spiraled. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't chaos. It was worse. It was public rejection. Meghan blinked twice, the corners of her mouth twitching. Her poise was cracking. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was at a women's summit, surrounded by people who were supposed to understand her, support her. The boos earlier were bad enough, but this? Being directly challenged in front of the cameras? It was humiliation, raw and unfiltered. Still, she forced herself to respond. Her voice, though steady, carried an edge now, the polished empathy giving way to something colder. "I'm sorry that my truth makes some people uncomfortable," she said. "But I'll never apologize for speaking it." Half the audience clapped. Half didn't. The divide was visible, like a fault line running through the room. And the woman who had spoken first? She just sat back, folded her arms, and smiled faintly, not with smugness, but with quiet defiance. As if to say, finally, someone said it. That's when security began to move. Two event staffers approached from the side aisles, scanning the crowd for any signs of escalation. They didn't remove anyone. No one had broken any rules, but their presence was enough to amplify the unease. The sight of uniformed staff patrolling an empowerment event sent the message loud and clear. Something had gone terribly wrong. Backstage, Meghan's team was in full panic mode. Her publicist was already drafting a statement. Her assistant whispered, "We need to get her out after this." Quietly, the PR advisor argued, "No, she needs to stay visible. Walking out looks guilty." It was chaos and whispers, strategy colliding with emotion. But on stage, Meghan wasn't thinking about PR anymore. She was thinking about survival. She adjusted her stance, clasped her hands together, and looked out over the audience. For a moment, she didn't speak. The silence stretched long enough for the tension to harden. And then, in a tone almost trembling but determined, she said, "I came here because I believe that power is not given, it's taken. And when women tear each other down in rooms like this, we give it away." There it was, the turning point. It should have redeemed her. On another day, in another city, maybe it would have. But in that room, it landed wrong again. Because to the audience, it sounded less like a rallying cry and more like accusation. The undertone wasn't unity, it was condescension. Several people shifted uncomfortably. One woman rolled her eyes. Another took out her phone and began recording. You could feel the energy drain, like air leaving a balloon. And then, from the back of the room, another voice, male this time, broke the silence. "Enough with the victim act." The words hit like a gunshot. Meghan froze mid-breath. The moderator gasped audibly. Several people shouted, "Hey," and "Stop." But the damage was already done. For the first time, Meghan's composure faltered completely. Her lips parted. Her eyes widened just slightly, that tiny flicker of disbelief you can't fake. She wasn't being questioned now. She was being attacked. The audience split instantly. Some booed the heckler for disrespecting her. Others clapped faintly, as if agreeing with him. The sound became chaos. Overlapping shouts, gasps, awkward laughter. Cameras swung wildly, catching fragments of faces, outrage, shock, discomfort. And Meghan, standing under the harsh lights, had no escape. Every instinct told her to walk off. But walking off would be defeat. So she did the only thing she could. She fought for control. She raised her voice slightly, not shouting, but firm.